A world on edge. The late August sun hung heavy over the city, casting a warm golden hue that draped the buildings like an ornate veil, softening their otherwise harsh edges. But beneath this idyllic glow, New York City simmered with an undercurrent of tension so thick it was palpable. In recent weeks, the Black Lives Matter movement had once again risen to the forefront of public consciousness, ignited by another instance of police brutality. This time, it was personal for Tamara Johnson. Tamara stood at her kitchen counter, absent-mindedly stirring a glass of lemonade, while her mind drifted to the protest she would soon attend. The rhythmic sounds of traffic outside, mingled with the distant honking of horns, filled her apartment. The world continued to move, but she felt its weight more heavily than ever before. At 8 months pregnant, everything seemed more profound. Every injustice, every death, every moment of silence in the face of violence. Her unborn child stirred within her, a gentle reminder of the life she was tasked with protecting. But how could she protect them from a world that viewed their existence as a threat? The protest today was different. It was more than a gathering, more than a march for justice. It was a manifestation of years, centuries, of anger, grief, and hope colliding in the hearts of people who had been silenced for far too long. Tamara wasn't someone who sought the limelight or craved attention, but today she felt drawn to the streets. She needed to be there. Her husband, David, an FBI agent, had warned her to stay home, but she couldn't. Not this time. Not after everything they had been through. After everything she had seen. She glanced at the time on her phone. She had an hour before the protest began, but she liked to arrive early, blending into the crowd before the swell of people overwhelmed the streets. Her eyes flickered toward a framed photo of her and David on their wedding day, their faces beaming with joy, their futures bright with promise. That day had felt like a lifetime ago, back when the world seemed kinder, back when she had believed they could carve out a space of safety for themselves, despite the challenges that came with being a black couple in America. Now, with their child on the way, the stakes were higher. It wasn't just about their future anymore. It was about the future of their child, about a world where every step outside their home would be fraught with risk. She placed a hand on her belly, feeling the gentle kick of her baby. "I'm doing this for you," she whispered softly, feeling a swell of emotion rise in her chest. "For you and for every child that will come after you." As Tamara prepared to leave, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from David, checking in once again, asking if she'd reconsidered staying home. She loved him for wording, but she knew that no matter how much he wanted to protect her, this was something she had to do. "I'll be safe. I promise. Love you," she texted back before slipping her phone into her bag and heading for the door. The streets were already alive by the time Tamara reached the protest site, a large avenue flanked by towering office buildings that stood like silent sentinels, witnesses to the unfolding history below. The sun was high, casting long shadows across the pavement as people of all races and backgrounds began to gather, their faces set with determination, their signs raised in a silent roar of defiance. No justice, no peace. Black Lives Matter. End police brutality. Each message a cry for a world that had long been denied to them. Tamara felt the familiar mix of fear and hope settle in her chest as she moved through the crowd. She clutched her bag tighter, her steps slower than usual due to her pregnancy. The baby moved within her, and she wondered if they could sense the electricity in the air, the raw emotion that vibrated through the streets. She hoped they felt the strength, the solidarity that pulsed around them. As she neared the front of the protest, she noticed familiar faces, activists she had seen on television, local leaders who had been speaking out for years, and young people full of fire and determination, ready to make their mark on the world. Despite her quiet demeanor, Tamara had always admired those who could speak loudly, fearlessly, standing at the front lines of every march, every rally. Today, she realized, she was one of them. The rhythmic chants began, rolling like thunder through the crowd. Say his name. George Floyd. Say her name. Breonna Taylor. The names came in waves, each one a wound that had yet to heal. Each name was a reminder of why they were all here, standing in the heat, demanding justice from a system that had never served them. Tamara raised her fist in solidarity, her eyes scanning the signs held high above the crowd. We will not be silent. Enough is enough. Every word hit her like a blow, but also like a balm, as if finally the world was waking up to the pain she and others had lived with for so long. Across the street, the police formed a line, a wall of blue, cold, and unyielding. Their presence was as much a message as the protest itself. They were here to remind everyone of the power they held, the control they exerted over these moments of resistance. Tamara's heart tightened as she watched them, their faces hidden behind sunglasses and their hands resting casually on their belts, near their batons and pepper spray. She had seen this play out before, had watched in horror as peaceful protests dissolved into violence at the hands of those meant to protect. But today, she couldn't afford to focus on the fear. Today, she had to focus on hope. For her baby, for herself, for her community. The chants grew louder, and Tamara found herself swept up in the power of the crowd, her voice blending with the thousands of others. She was not alone. They were not alone. She caught a glimpse of one officer standing slightly apart from the rest, his stance rigid, his fists clenched. His gaze was hard, almost hostile, as he surveyed the crowd. Tamara's stomach twisted with a sense of foreboding. There was something about the way he looked at them, at her, that unsettled her deeply. But she pushed the thought away, focusing instead on the people around her, the strength in their unity. She wouldn't let fear dictate this day. As the afternoon wore on, the energy of the protest ebbed and flowed. There were moments of peaceful stillness, where the crowd simply stood together in solidarity, and moments where the chants grew so loud they seemed to shake the very ground beneath them. Tamara stayed near the front, her hand protectively resting on her belly as she watched the sun dip lower in the sky. She had no way of knowing that her life was about to change in a way she never could have anticipated. A sudden commotion at the front of the protest caught her attention. There was a shift in the air, a ripple of tension that moved through the crowd like a wave. People began murmuring, some raising their phones to capture the scene unfolding at the edge of the police line. Tamara squinted, trying to see what was happening. There was a young man, no older than 20, arguing with one of the officers. His fists were clenched at his sides, his voice raised in anger, though Tamara couldn't make out the words. The officer, Mark Anderson, she later learned, stood tall, his face twisted with frustration and something darker, something meaner. The crowd sensed it too. The shift from frustration to violence was always swift, almost imperceptible until it was too late. The officer's hand moved to his baton. "Hey, back off," someone shouted from the crowd, but it was too late. The baton came down with brutal force. The crack that shattered everything. The crack of the baton against flesh echoed through the air like the sound of a gunshot. For a moment, everything froze. The chants, the raised fists, the collective outcry, all suspended in a single, suffocating silence. Tamara's heart stopped as her breath caught in her throat. She had seen protests escalate before, but never like this, never so close, never with her standing just feet away from the violence. The young man stumbled back, clutching his chest where the baton had struck him. His face twisted in pain, a mixture of shock and defiance etched into his expression. He wasn't backing down, even as his friends rushed to his side, trying to pull him away from the scene. The crowd erupted, a chorus of angry voices surging forward in response to the officer's unprovoked attack. Shouts of "police brutality," and he didn't do anything, rang out, cutting through the stunned silence. Tamara's hand instinctively went to her belly as fear gripped her heart. The tension in the air was thick, almost electric, and she could feel it tightening around her like a noose. She had come here for peace, for justice, for her child's future, but now, the peaceful protest was teetering on the edge of chaos. The officer, Mark Anderson, stood over the young man, his face a mask of indifference. No, it was more than that. There was a spark of something vindictive in his eyes, a hint of satisfaction that made Tamara's skin crawl. He took a step forward, his baton still raised, as if daring the young man to challenge him further. Enough! Tamara's voice, surprisingly loud and steady, cut through the cacophony. She hadn't intended to speak, hadn't planned to intervene, but something inside her, something primal, something born of the need to protect her child, pushed her forward. The crowd parted slightly, giving her a clear path as she stepped toward the officer. Officer Anderson turned toward her, his gaze locking onto hers with a cold intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. He didn't lower his baton. "Why are you doing this?" Tamara asked, her voice firm but laced with an undercurrent of desperation. She kept her hand protectively over her belly, her other hand clenched into a fist at her side. "Why are you here if all you're going to do is hurt people? We're just trying to be heard." For a moment, the officer said nothing, his eyes flickering down to her belly before returning to her face. There was something dangerous in the way he looked at her, something that told her he saw her not as a person, but as a problem. His jaw tightened. "You people never learn," he muttered, his voice low and filled with disdain. Tamara felt a rush of anger surge through her, hot and fierce. "You people." The words hit her like a slap to the face, a stark reminder of how the world saw her, how the system viewed her existence. She had heard those words before, spoken with the same venom by teachers, bosses, strangers on the street, but hearing them now, from a man who was supposed to protect and serve, felt like a betrayal deeper than anything she had ever experienced. Before she could respond, Officer Anderson took a step toward her, his baton still raised. The crowd around them tensed, and for a moment, Tamara felt as if the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. And then he swung. The blow came faster than she could react, a blur of movement followed by an explosion of pain. The baton struck her across the face, sending a sharp, burning ache radiating through her cheek and down to her jaw. She stumbled backward, her vision blurring as tears filled her eyes. For a moment, the world tilted on its axis, and she struggled to regain her balance. Her hand flew to her face, instinctively covering the spot where the baton had connected. The skin beneath her fingers was already tender, swelling rapidly, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the panic that surged through her as she realized what had just happened. Her baby. The fear hit her like a tidal wave, drowning out everything else. Her free hand immediately went to her belly, pressing down gently as if she could somehow protect the life growing inside her. Her heart raced, each beat pounding in her ears as she desperately tried to feel any movement, any sign that her baby was okay. The crowd erupted in chaos around her, but Tamara could barely register it. All she could think about was her child, the life she had promised to protect, the future she had sworn to fight for. She had never been more terrified in her life. "Tamara." A familiar voice cut through the noise, and she turned just in time to see one of her friends, a fellow activist named Kendra, rushing toward her. Kendra's face was etched with horror as she reached Tamara, her hands hovering uncertainly, not sure where to touch, how to help. "Oh my God, are you okay?" I don't know," Tamara stammered, her voice trembling as she pressed her hand to her belly. She was shaking, her body trembling uncontrollably from the shock and fear. "I can't feel the baby. I don't." "We need to get you to a hospital," Kendra said urgently, her eyes darting around as she waved to others in the crowd for help. "Someone call 911. She's pregnant." Within seconds, people were surrounding Tamara, their faces filled with concern and outrage. Several protesters stepped forward to shield her from the officers, while others began shouting at Officer Anderson, their anger boiling over into curses and accusations. The police line wavered, the tension escalating as more officers moved in, their batons raised, ready to retaliate against the growing unrest. But Tamara barely registered any of it. Her vision swam as she struggled to stay upright, her body threatening to give out beneath the weight of the pain and fear. She could hear voices around her, the shouts and chants of the crowd, but they felt distant, muffled by the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. "I'm okay," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was saying it for herself or for the people around her. "I'm okay." But she wasn't. Kendra's hand rested gently on her back, steadying her as she began to guide her away from the chaos. "We're going to get you out of here," Kendra said softly, her voice filled with determination. "Don't worry. We're going to take care of you." Tamara nodded, though her thoughts were far from coherent. Everything felt surreal, like she was moving through a dream, her body heavy and sluggish, her mind unable to process the enormity of what had just happened. They were only a few feet away from the main street when Tamara felt a sharp pain in her abdomen. She gasped, her hand flying to her belly as she doubled over in agony. The world around her blurred, the edges of her vision darkening as her breath came in short, ragged bursts. "No, no, no, no," she whispered, her voice barely audible as the pain intensified. "Not the baby. Please, not the baby." Kendra's face was a mask of fear as she knelt beside her, her hands shaking as she fumbled for her phone. "Hang on, Tamara," she said, her voice cracking with panic. "Just hang on. We're getting you help." Tamara closed her eyes, her body trembling as she fought to stay conscious. Her thoughts were jumbled, incoherent, as she tried to make sense of the pain coursing through her. She couldn't lose her baby. Not like this. Not here, in the middle of the street, surrounded by chaos and violence. She had come here to fight for her child's future, for a world where they wouldn't have to fear for their life every time they stepped outside. But now, as she lay on the ground, the pain radiating through her body, she felt that future slipping away, as if it were being ripped from her hands. The sound of sirens filled the air, and Tamara felt Kendra's hand squeeze hers. "The ambulance is here," Kendra said, her voice strained with emotion. "You're going to be okay. Just hold on." But Tamara's mind was already drifting, her body succumbing to the weight of exhaustion and pain. Her vision blurred, the world around her fading into a haze of noise and confusion. She could hear the faint sound of the crowd, their voices rising in anger, but it felt distant, like it was happening to someone else. Her last conscious thought before everything went dark was of her child, the life she had fought so hard to protect. She could feel them moving inside her, a small, reassuring flutter that anchored her in the storm of chaos surrounding her. And then everything went black. When Tamara awoke, the world was quieter, softer. The bright, sterile lights of the hospital room replaced the chaotic blur of the streets. The first thing she felt was the dull, throbbing ache in her face, a reminder of the Baton strike that had knocked her off her feet. But the pain in her body was nothing compared to the fear that gripped her heart. Her hand flew to her belly, and she let out a shaky breath when she felt the familiar flutter of movement. Relief flooded through her, but the fear lingered, gnawing at the edges of her mind. Her baby was still with her, but the fight was far from over. The weight of the world. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the air, a sharp contrast to the raw heat and grime of the protest Tamara had just left behind. The hospital room was a world unto itself, cool, clean, and eerily quiet, save for the soft beeping of monitors that kept a steady rhythm. But inside Tamara's chest, her heart pounded with a frantic, uneven beat, her thoughts scattered like shards of broken glass. The room might have been still, but her mind was a chaotic storm. She lay back against the stiff hospital bed, her body heavy with exhaustion. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting harsh shadows over the bruises blooming on her face. Her cheek throbbed where Officer Anderson's baton had struck her, and every breath felt like a struggle, as though the weight of the world had settled on her chest, refusing to let go. But none of that mattered. Not the pain, not the exhaustion, not even the sting of the baton's blow. All she could focus on was the gentle flutter of her baby moving inside her. It was the only thing that kept her grounded, kept her from spiraling into the deep well of fear and anger that threatened to consume her. The door to her hospital room creaked open, and a nurse entered, her face kind but professional. She was carrying a clipboard and moving with the brisk efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Tamara's eyes followed her as she crossed the room, her footsteps soft against the linoleum floor. "Mrs. Johnson," the nurse said in a low, soothing voice as she approached the bed. "How are you feeling?" Tamara swallowed hard, trying to find her voice. I'm okay," she whispered, though she knew it wasn't entirely true. Physically, she was bruised and battered, but emotionally, she felt as though she had been shattered into a million pieces. "The baby, are they okay?" The nurse gave her a reassuring smile, setting the clipboard down on a small metal table next to the bed. "We've been monitoring the baby's heartbeat closely, and everything looks stable for now. The doctor will be in shortly to do another ultrasound, just to make sure there's no further cause for concern. But so far, things are looking good." Tamara let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, relief washing over her in waves. Stable. That word, as clinical as it sounded, was a lifeline in this moment of overwhelming uncertainty. But even as the relief settled in, the questions began to creep back into her mind. How had things spiraled out of control so quickly? She had gone to the protest filled with hope, determined to be part of the movement for change, to fight for her unborn child's future. And now here she was, lying in a hospital bed, her face bruised, her body aching, and the future she had fought so hard for suddenly seemed more fragile than ever. The nurse checked Tamara's vitals, her movements swift and practiced. Tamara closed her eyes, trying to block out the sterile brightness of the room, trying to return to that moment of hope before everything had gone wrong. But she couldn't. Her thoughts were a whirlwind, spinning faster and faster until they collided with the memory of Officer Anderson's face, the cold, hard look in his eyes, the hatred simmering just beneath the surface as he raised his baton. She had seen that look before, countless times in the faces of other officers, other authority figures who saw her not as a person but as a problem. But this time had been different. This time, she had felt the full force of that hatred, physically and viscerally, in a way she had never experienced before. How many times had she heard stories like this? How many black men and women had been struck down by police violence, their names turned into hashtags, their lives reduced to symbols of a system that refused to see them as human. And now, she was one of them. Her story was no longer her own. It was part of the larger narrative of brutality and injustice that had been woven into the fabric of America for centuries. Tamara opened her eyes, staring up at the ceiling as tears began to blur her vision. She didn't want to be a symbol. She didn't want to be another name added to the long list of victims. All she had wanted was to be heard, to stand up for her child, for their future. But now, it felt like that future was slipping through her fingers, like everything she had hoped for was crumbling under the weight of a system that refused to change. The nurse finished her checks and gave Tamara another gentle smile before heading toward the door. "The doctor will be in soon," she said softly. "Try to rest for now." As the door clicked shut behind her, the silence in the room became almost suffocating. Tamara closed her eyes again, but this time, all she could see was the image of Officer Anderson's baton, the crack as it connected with her face, the moment when everything had changed. The hours passed in a blur, punctuated by the steady rhythm of the hospital machines and the occasional soft shuffle of nurses outside her room. Tamara had lost track of time, her thoughts drifting in and out of focus as she tried to process everything that had happened. The fear, the anger, the overwhelming sense of helplessness, it all mingled together in a thick haze that refused to lift. It wasn't until later that evening, as the light outside her window began to fade into the soft hues of twilight, that the door opened again. This time, it wasn't a nurse, it was David. Tamara's heart skipped a beat at the sight of him. He stood in the doorway for a moment, his face tense with worry, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on her. And then, without a word, he crossed the room in a few long strides, kneeling beside her bed and taking her hand in his. "Tamara," he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. I've been trying to get here all day. I'm so sorry." Tears filled her eyes as she looked at him, her throat tightening. "David," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It all happened so fast. I didn't know what to do." David's grip on her hand tightened, his expression a mixture of anger and heartbreak. "I saw the footage," he said, his voice low. "I saw what they did to you." Tamara swallowed hard, her eyes dropping to where their hands were entwined. "I was just trying to stand up for us. For our baby. I didn't think it would. I didn't think he would." She trailed off, her voice catching in her throat. David shook his head, his jaw clenched. "You shouldn't have had to do this alone," he said, his voice filled with regret. "I should have been there. I should have." "It's not your fault," Tamara interrupted, her voice stronger now. "This is bigger than us, David. You know that." David exhaled, his shoulders sagging under the weight of her words. He knew she was right. This fight, this struggle, it had been going on long before they were even born. It was a battle that had been passed down through generations, a fight for justice and equality that had claimed too many lives already. But that didn't make it any easier. "I'm not going to let them get away with this," David said, his voice hardening with determination. "Officer Anderson, he's not walking away from this without consequences." Tamara looked into his eyes and saw the fire burning there. The same fire she had seen in him the day they met, the day they decided to build a life together. He had always been a protector, someone who stood up for what was right, no matter the cost. But now, that fire was tinged with something darker, a deep, simmering anger that had been building for years. "I know," Tamara said softly, "but we have to be smart about this. We can't let them use this against us. We have to be strategic." David nodded, though she could see the frustration flickering behind his eyes. He had always been the one to take action, to fight back when things weren't right. But this time, the stakes were higher than ever. Their child's future was on the line, and they couldn't afford to make a single misstep. "I'm with you," he said quietly, his thumb brushing over the back of her hand. "Whatever you need, I'm here." Tamara squeezed his hand, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I need you to help me stay strong," she whispered. "For our baby. For all of us." David leaned forward, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. "You're the strongest person I know," he murmured against her skin. "We'll get through this." Tamara closed her eyes, letting his words wash over her, comforting her in a way that nothing else could. She knew that the fight ahead would be long and brutal, that the road to justice was filled with obstacles. But with David by her side, she felt just a little bit stronger, a little more ready to face whatever was coming. As the night wore on, the sounds from outside the hospital began to filter in, distant chants, the hum of a crowd growing larger with each passing hour. Tamara turned her head toward the window, her heart tightening as she realized what was happening. The protest hadn't stopped, it had grown. "They're still out there," she murmured, her voice filled with a mixture of awe and disbelief. David glanced toward the window, nodding grimly. "The news picked up what happened. Word spread fast. People are demanding justice for you." Tamara's stomach twisted. She hadn't wanted this. She hadn't wanted to become the center of attention, to be the face of yet another instance of police brutality. But now, it seemed, she had no choice. "It's not just about me," she said softly. "It's about all of us. All of the people who've been hurt, all the lives that have been taken. This isn't just my fight." David nodded, his gaze steady. "I know, but you're part of it now, Tamara. Whether you wanted to be or not, you're part of this movement." Tamara closed her eyes, her hand resting protectively over her belly. She could feel her baby moving inside her, a small, comforting reminder of the life she was fighting for. And in that moment, she knew that no matter how tired she was, no matter how afraid she felt, she couldn't stop now. Because this wasn't just about her. This was about her child. About every child who would grow up in a world that didn't see them, didn't value them, didn't protect them. And she wasn't going to let that happen. Not now. Not ever. Outside the hospital, the crowd had swelled to thousands, their voices rising into the night like a battle cry. Signs waved high above their heads, banners proclaiming messages of justice, equality, and an end to police violence. The energy was palpable, a surge of collective power that had been building for years, waiting for the moment to break free. At the edge of the protest, Kendra stood with a group of organizers, her face set with determination, as she watched the crowd grow. She had been at the forefront of these movements for years, had seen countless protests rise and fall, had witnessed both victories and defeats. But tonight felt different. There was something in the air, something stronger, something more urgent. This wasn't just a protest. This was a reckoning. And Tamara Johnson's name was on everyone's lips. Justice for Tamara. The crowd chanted, their voices growing louder with each passing minute. No justice, no peace. The police line at the far end of the street was growing thicker, more officers arriving with each wave of protesters. The tension was mounting, the atmosphere charged with the potential for violence. But Kendra knew that they couldn't let that happen. They had to stay peaceful. They had to keep their message clear. Because if they didn't, the system would win. She glanced toward the hospital, knowing that Tamara was inside, resting, recovering. And though she couldn't see her, Kendra felt her presence, felt the weight of what had been done to her, what had been done to all of them. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. Flames of defiance. The night outside the hospital was no longer just a protest. It had evolved into something far more significant, a crescendo of pent-up anger and collective determination. The streets of New York City, once a bustling hub of traffic and hurried pedestrians, were now dominated by a sea of people whose chants reverberated through the concrete canyons, rising like smoke into the sky. The crowd had swelled to thousands, spilling into every street and alley within blocks of the hospital. This was no ordinary protest. It was a reckoning. From her hospital bed, Tamara could hear them. The muffled chants and distant roars filtered in through the thick walls, a reminder of the movement that had taken root outside. Her name was being shouted by people she had never met, by strangers who had taken up her cause, her pain, and turned it into fuel for a fire that could no longer be contained. Justice for Tamara. They cried over and over again. The rhythm of their voices matched the pounding of her own heartbeat, a pulse of life that echoed through the sterile room. She lay still, her hand resting protectively over her belly, feeling the gentle, reassuring movements of her baby beneath her palm. But while her body remained in the hospital bed, her heart and mind were out there with the people, standing on the front lines of a fight that had consumed her entire being. She didn't ask to be a part of this war, but now there was no escaping it. She was no longer just Tamara Johnson, a woman, a wife, a mother-to-be. She had become a symbol, and symbols didn't get to rest. David had stepped out of the room briefly, conferring with FBI colleagues who were working behind the scenes to ensure that justice wouldn't just be a slogan this time. He was doing what he did best, strategizing, putting pieces into place, ensuring that the system didn't swallow them whole. But even he knew how precarious the situation was. The justice system was like a glacier. It moved slowly, coldly, and often crushed those beneath it. They had to stay ahead of it, make sure it didn't drag them down before they could make a real impact. As she lay there, staring at the blank ceiling, her thoughts drifted back to the moment everything had changed. Officer Mark Anderson's face was seared into her memory. The coldness in his eyes, the indifference, the way his baton had risen and fallen with the ease of a man who had done this before, a man who had never been held accountable. How many times had men like him gotten away with it? How many times had their violence been excused, buried under reports filled with carefully crafted lies and bureaucratic jargon? Not this time. She wouldn't let it happen again. The door creaked open softly, pulling her from her thoughts. David stepped inside, his face drawn with exhaustion, but his eyes sharp and alert. He closed the door behind him, his footsteps soft as he crossed the room to her bedside. "How are you feeling?" he asked quietly, his hand reaching for hers. "I'm okay," Tamara lied, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. She squeezed his hand gently, grateful for his presence, for the solidness of him. But even as she said the words, she knew they weren't true. How could she be okay? How could anyone be okay after what had happened? David sat down beside her, his eyes scanning her face as if trying to read the thoughts she wasn't saying out loud. He knew her better than anyone, knew how strong she was, how much weight she carried on her shoulders without complaint. But he also knew that this time was different. This time, the burden was too heavy, even for her. "Tamara," he said softly, his voice laced with concern. "You don't have to be strong all the time. It's okay to." "I know," she interrupted, her voice sharper than she intended. She took a breath, forcing herself to soften. "I know, David, but I have to be strong right now. For us. For the baby. For everyone out there." She gestured weakly toward the window, where the chants of the protesters still echoed in the distance. "They're fighting for me. I can't fall apart. Not now." David's jaw tightened, and she could see the frustration flickering behind his eyes. He wanted to protect her, wanted to shield her from all of this, but he knew he couldn't. Not this time. This wasn't something he could fight for her. It was something they had to face together. "They're not going anywhere," he said quietly, glancing toward the window. "The crowd's grown since I left. People are still pouring in from across the city. The media's all over it. This is bigger than we expected." Tamara nodded, her throat tightening as she thought about the thousands of people who had shown up to demand justice. It was overwhelming, humbling, but it was also terrifying, because with every hour that passed, with every new person who joined the protest, the tension grew thicker, the atmosphere more volatile. She had been to enough protests to know how quickly things could spiral out of control, how easily a peaceful demonstration could turn into a battleground. "They're going to crack down, aren't they?" she asked softly, already knowing the answer. David's silence was all the confirmation she needed. He didn't want to say it, didn't want to admit that the police were already preparing for a confrontation, but she could see it in his eyes. The NYPD wouldn't let this go on much longer. They would come in with riot gear, with batons and tear gas, and they would crush the protest if they had to. And if that happened, more people would get hurt, more lives would be at risk. "I talked to Lisa," David said after a long pause, his voice low and measured. "She's working with the FBI to investigate Anderson. There's already pressure mounting on the NYPD to hold him accountable. But you know how these things go. It's going to be a fight." Tamara clenched her jaw, her anger simmering just beneath the surface. Of course, it was going to be a fight. It was always a fight. Nothing came easy when you were black in America, especially not justice. "What about the media?" she asked. "Are they helping?" David nodded. "They're covering the protest, and they've picked up on your story. It's everywhere. Social media is blowing up. People are calling for Anderson to be fired or arrested. But the department's holding the line for now. They're not giving in without a fight." Tamara closed her eyes, letting the weight of his words settle over her. The media might be on their side now, but she knew how fickle the news cycle could be. One wrong move, one spark of violence, and the narrative would shift. They had to be careful. They couldn't give the system any excuse to turn them into the villains. "David," she said after a long silence, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm scared." It was the first time she had admitted it, even to herself. She had been so focused on staying strong, on holding it together, that she hadn't allowed herself to feel the fear that had been gnawing at her since the moment Anderson's baton had struck her. But now, with David sitting beside her, with the chants of the protesters ringing in her ears, she couldn't keep it inside any longer. David's hand tightened around hers, his eyes softening. "I know," he said quietly. "I'm scared too. Tamara opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. There was something comforting in the way he looked at her, in the way he acknowledged their fear without letting it consume them. He had always been her anchor, her steady rock in the storm, and even now, in the midst of chaos, he was there for her. "But we can't stop now," she whispered, her voice filled with a quiet resolve. "We can't let them win. Not this time." David nodded, his jaw set with determination. "We won't," he promised. "We're going to see this through. Together." Outside the hospital, the protest continued to swell. The chants had grown louder, more defiant, as the crowd surged through the streets, blocking traffic and occupying entire city blocks. The police presence had grown as well. Rows of officers in riot gear stood at the ready, their faces hidden behind helmets, their batons gripped tightly in their hands. At the center of it all stood Kendra, her megaphone raised high above her head as she led the chants, her voice ringing out over the crowd with a fierce, unyielding energy. She had been organizing protests for years, but this one felt different. This one felt like a turning point. The air was thick with tension, the kind of tension that could snap at any moment. Kendra could feel it, could sense the electricity in the air, the way the crowd's anger simmered just beneath the surface, waiting for a spark to ignite it. She had been in this position before, had seen how quickly things could go wrong. But tonight, she was determined to keep it from happening. This protest had to stay peaceful. It had to. "Stay strong," she shouted into the megaphone, her voice echoing down the street. "We're here for justice. We're here for Tamara." The crowd roared in response, their fists raised high as they chanted her name. But even as the crowd's energy surged, Kendra's eyes flickered to the line of police officers standing just beyond the barricades. They were waiting, watching, ready to move in at the first sign of trouble. And she knew that if things escalated, if even one person stepped out of line, they would use it as an excuse to crack down. She couldn't let that happen. Kendra glanced at her fellow organizers, nodding at them to spread out and keep the crowd in check. They had prepared for this, had drilled into the protesters the importance of staying peaceful, of not giving the police any reason to intervene. But the longer the night went on, the more restless the crowd became. People were tired. They were angry, and they had every right to be. But that anger could turn dangerous if it wasn't channeled properly. "Remember why we're here," Kendra called out, her voice rising above the crowd. "We're here for Tamara, for justice, for all of us. Stay strong, stay peaceful, and we will win." The crowd responded with a wave of cheers, but Kendra could still feel the tension simmering beneath the surface. She knew that they were walking a fine line, and any wrong move could tip the balance. Back inside the hospital, Tamara sat up in bed, her gaze fixed on the window as the sound of the protest filtered in. The sun had long since set, and the darkness outside was punctuated only by the glow of streetlights and the occasional flash of a camera from the media covering the event. She felt restless, trapped inside the sterile walls of the hospital while the world outside was on fire. She wanted to be out there, wanted to stand with the people who had shown up for her, who had taken up her cause and made it their own. But she couldn't. Not now. Not while her baby's future hung in the balance. Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft chime of her phone. She reached for it, glancing at the screen. A text message from Kendra. "We're holding the line, but it's tense. Stay strong. We've got your back." Tamara's heart swelled with gratitude as she read the message. Kendra had been a force of nature from the moment they had met, always at the forefront of the movement, always fighting for justice with a fire that seemed unquenchable. And now she was out there, leading the charge, making sure that Tamara's story didn't become just another headline lost in the chaos. Tamara quickly typed a response, her fingers trembling slightly as she hit send. "Thank you. Stay safe." As she set her phone down, a surge of emotion washed over her, a mix of fear, gratitude, and determination. She didn't know what the next few days would bring. She didn't know if justice would be served, if Officer Anderson would be held accountable, or if the system would once again fail them. But she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't alone. There were people out there, thousands of them, who were fighting for her, who were standing up for what was right. And as long as they continued to fight, as long as they refused to back down, there was hope. And hope, she realized, was the most powerful weapon they had. As the night deepened and the protest raged on, the line between peace and violence grew thinner. The tension was like a lit fuse, ready to ignite at any moment. But even in the face of overwhelming pressure, the crowd remained steadfast, their voices united in a call for justice that could not be silenced. Justice for Tamara, they chanted, their voices rising into the night like a prayer. And inside the hospital, Tamara closed her eyes, letting their words wash over her like a balm to her wounded soul. Because no matter what happened next, no matter how long the fight lasted, she knew one thing for certain. They were not going to let her be forgotten. The storm unleashed. The night had grown thick and oppressive. The tension outside the hospital was palpable, a living thing that clung to the air, charging it with a sense of impending disaster. The crowd had swollen to unmanageable proportions, spilling into every nearby street, their chants of justice for Tamara. Now a relentless drumbeat echoing off the skyscrapers and reverberating through the concrete jungle of New York City. From her hospital bed, Tamara could still hear them, their voices rising in a crescendo of righteous anger. It should have brought her some comfort, some reassurance that her story, her pain, was not in vain. But all she could feel now was a deep, gnawing sense of dread. She had always known this fight was bigger than her, bigger than any one person. She had joined the protest for her unborn child, to fight for a world in which they wouldn't have to live in fear. But now, she felt like she was drowning in a tidal wave of forces far beyond her control. The protest had taken on a life of its own, and with every passing minute, she could feel the momentum shifting towards something dangerous. David had been at her side for most of the day, but now he was out there, somewhere in the crowd, working to keep the peace, to ensure that the protest didn't descend into chaos. He had kissed her softly on the forehead before he left, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and worry, and whispered, "I'll be back soon. Don't worry. We're going to be okay." But how could she not worry? How could she not feel the fear gnawing at her, threatening to overwhelm her with every breath? She glanced at the window, where the faint glow of streetlights illuminated the dark sky. Somewhere out there, just beyond the walls of the hospital, the protest was reaching a boiling point. She could feel it in her bones. Outside, David stood near the front lines of the protest, his heart pounding as he scanned the sea of faces around him. He had spent the last several hours moving through the crowd, talking to the protest leaders, trying to keep the energy focused, trying to prevent the tension from exploding into violence. But it was getting harder. The crowd had grown restless, their anger bubbling over, and the presence of the police in full riot gear only fueled that frustration. Kendra was nearby, her megaphone raised as she led the chants, her voice hoarse but still powerful. "No justice, no peace," she shouted, her voice cutting through the noise. "No justice, no peace." The crowd roared in response, their fists raised in defiance, their signs waving high above their heads. But despite the strength of their voices, David could sense the shift in the atmosphere. He had seen this before, too many times, in too many cities. It was the moment when peaceful protests tipped over into something far more dangerous. He glanced toward the police line, his stomach tightening as he saw them shifting into position. The officers stood shoulder to shoulder, their shields raised, their batons at the ready. They were waiting for a spark, waiting for any excuse to move in and crush the protest. "David," Kendra's voice broke through his thoughts, and he turned to see her pushing through the crowd toward him, her expression tense. "The police are about to make a move. They've been sending in more units for the last hour. We need to do something." David nodded, his jaw clenched. He had seen the reinforcements arriving, the slow buildup of police presence that was meant to intimidate the crowd, to force them into submission. But the protesters weren't backing down. If anything, the growing police force only strengthened their resolve. "We can't let this turn violent," David said, his voice low but firm. "If the police come in with force, it's going to be a bloodbath. We have to keep this peaceful." Kendra's eyes flicked to the police line, then back to David. "I'm doing everything I can to keep people calm, but they're angry, David. They have every right to be. And the police, they're just waiting for any excuse to move in." David knew she was right. The people had every reason to be angry. Tamara had been assaulted by an officer of the law, a man sworn to protect and serve, and she wasn't the first. The list of black men and women who had been brutalized by police was long, far too long, and it stretched back through generations. This wasn't just about Tamara. It was about every person who had ever been dehumanized by the system, every person who had ever been treated as less than human. But even so, they couldn't let that anger boil over. Not here. Not tonight. If the protest turned violent, the media would seize on it, and the narrative would shift. The system would win. They had to stay in control. "I'm going to talk to the police captain," David said, his voice tight with resolve. "Maybe I can buy us some time, keep them from moving in." Kendra nodded, though her expression was grim. "Be careful. They're on edge." David gave her a brief nod before turning toward the police line. He pushed through the crowd, his heart pounding as he made his way toward the barricade. As he approached, he could see the tension in the officers' faces, the way their bodies were coiled, ready to spring into action at any moment. When he reached the front, he raised his hands in a gesture of peace, trying to signal to the officers that he wasn't a threat. "I need to speak to Captain Walters," he called out, his voice steady despite the fear churning in his gut. One of the officers stepped forward, his face obscured by his helmet, but his posture rigid with authority. "What do you want?" David swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay calm. "I'm Agent David Johnson, FBI. I need to speak with the captain. We can still keep this protest peaceful, but if you move in now, it's going to turn violent. You know that." The officer hesitated for a moment before nodding curtly. "Wait here." David watched as the officer turned and disappeared into the line of riot police, heading toward the back where Captain Walters stood, overseeing the situation. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. The crowd behind him was growing louder, more restless, and the police were growing more rigid, their fingers twitching on their batons. Finally, Captain Walters appeared, his face set in a hard, unreadable expression as he approached David. The captain had been leading the NYPD's response to the protest since it began, and David knew that Walters was under immense pressure to bring the situation under control. But what did control look like? Would it be another violent crackdown? More blood on the streets? "Agent Johnson," Walters said, his voice clipped. "What do you need?" David took a deep breath, meeting the captain's gaze head-on. "I'm asking you to hold off. Let me work with the protest leaders to keep this peaceful. The crowd's angry, but they're not looking for violence. If your officers move in now, it's going to escalate. People are going to get hurt. We can avoid that." Captain Walters' expression didn't change. He crossed his arms over his chest, glancing over at the crowd behind David. "We've given them plenty of time to disperse. They've blocked off multiple streets, disrupted traffic, and there's been vandalism. We have orders to restore order." David clenched his fists at his sides, trying to keep his frustration in check. "You and I both know that if you move in with riot gear, it's going to make things worse. The people are here because they're tired of being ignored, of being brutalized, of being treated like criminals in their own city. We can de-escalate this, but we need time." Walters was silent for a long moment, his eyes scanning the crowd. David could see the tension in his face, the way his jaw tightened as he weighed his options. The captain was caught between two forces, the political pressure from the mayor's office and the very real threat of violence if things went wrong. Finally, Walters sighed, lowering his arms. "I'll give you 20 minutes," he said, his voice low. "But if anything happens, anything, we're moving in." David nodded, relief flooding through him. "Thank you. I'll make sure nothing happens." As he turned to head back toward the protest leaders, he could feel the weight of the captain's warning pressing down on him. 20 minutes. That was all the time they had to keep this from spiraling out of control. Back in the heart of the protest, Kendra was doing everything she could to keep the crowd focused, to keep their anger from tipping over into chaos. She had been in this position before, had led dozens of protests in her life. But this one felt different. This one felt like a powder keg, ready to explode with the smallest spark. "Stay strong," she shouted into her megaphone, her voice strained from hours of chanting. "We're here for justice, not violence. Don't give them an excuse." The crowd responded with a roar of approval, but even as they shouted in agreement, Kendra could see the cracks forming. She could see the way people's faces were twisted with anger, the way their bodies were tense, ready to lash out. It was only a matter of time before someone, one person, did something that would set the whole thing off. As David approached, Kendra turned to him, her face lined with exhaustion. "What did the captain say?" "We've got 20 minutes, David said, his voice tight. "That's all the time we have to keep this from going south. If anything happens, they're moving in." Kendra nodded grimly. "That's not much time. The crowd's getting restless. I'm not sure we can hold them off for that long." David glanced over his shoulder at the police line, then back at Kendra. "We have to try." But even as they spoke, a sudden shout went up from somewhere in the crowd, followed by the sound of glass shattering. David's heart sank as he whipped around, his eyes scanning the sea of protesters. He couldn't see what had happened, but he knew that this was the spark they had all been dreading. The crowd surged forward, their chants growing louder, more frenzied, as the tension finally snapped. And then, all at once, the police moved in. From her hospital bed, Tamara's breath hitched as the sound of chaos erupted outside. She could hear the sudden shift, the roars of anger, the sharp cracks of confrontation, and her heart seized in her chest. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "No, no, no." Her hand flew to her belly, her fingers splaying protectively over the small, growing life inside her. She had feared this moment, had known deep down that it was coming, but hearing it, feeling it, was something else entirely. The peaceful protest was over. And now, it was war. David pushed his way through the crowd, his heart racing as the police advanced, their shields raised, their batons swinging. The protesters were surging in every direction, some trying to flee, others pushing back against the wall of riot police. "Fall back," David shouted, his voice drowned out by the cacophony around him. "Stay calm. Don't fight back." But it was too late. The line had been crossed, and now the full force of the NYPD was bearing down on the crowd, pushing them back with brutal efficiency. David caught sight of Kendra in the fray. Her megaphone knocked from her hands as she tried to hold the line, tried to keep people from being trampled in the chaos. He pushed toward her, his fists clenched as he fought his way through the crush of bodies. "Kendra," he shouted, his voice raw. "We have to get people out of here." But before he could reach her, a sudden wave of police officers surged forward, and he was knocked to the ground, his breath knocked from his lungs as the chaos engulfed him. The storm had been unleashed, and there was no going back now. Inside the hospital, Tamara's world narrowed to a single point of focus, her baby. She could feel the fear wrapping itself around her, tightening like a vise, but she refused to let it take hold. She couldn't. Not now. She closed her eyes, her hand trembling as she whispered to herself, "Stay strong. Stay strong." Because this fight wasn't over. Not yet. The aftermath of the storm, the sounds of chaos from the protest outside the hospital seemed to echo endlessly, reverberating through Tamara's body with each heartbeat. She could hear the roars of the crowd, The sharp clatter of buttons against shields, the panicked shouts and screams that filled the air like jagged shards of glass. It was everything she feared, everything she had wanted to avoid. And now it was happening. She sat up in her hospital bed, her body tense, her hands gripping the bedrail as though it could anchor her to something solid amidst the chaos. Her heart pounded wildly, her chest tight as she tried to keep her breath steady, tried to stay calm for her baby's sake. But it was impossible. Fear had settled deep into her bones, rooting her to the spot, while her mind raced with thoughts of David out there in the middle of it all. David, her husband, her rock. Where was he now? Was he okay? Was he safe? Her phone buzzed on the bedside table, breaking through the noise. Tamara snatched it up with trembling hands, her heart leaping as she saw Kendra's name flash across the screen. She fumbled to unlock the phone, her fingers slick with sweat, and quickly opened the message. Kendra, it's bad. The police moved in. David's out here. We're trying to hold things together, but people are getting hurt. Stay inside, okay? Don't come out. Tamara's stomach dropped. She knew Kendra wouldn't sugarcoat things. She never did. But seeing it spelled out like that made the panic she had been trying to suppress rush to the surface. People were getting hurt. David was out there. No, she whispered to herself, shaking her head as tears pricked at her eyes. Please, God, no. She wanted to do something, to help, to be out there with them, standing with the people who had come to support her, to fight for her, and for all those who had been wronged. But she couldn't. She was trapped in this hospital bed, a prisoner of her own body, her child's future weighing down on her with crushing intensity. Stay strong, she reminded herself, repeating the words over and over in her mind. For your baby, for David. But it was harder than ever to believe that they would come out of this unscathed. Outside, the street had become a battleground. The police had moved in with ruthless efficiency, pushing through the crowd with shields and batons, their faces obscured by helmets and gas masks. The protesters, caught off guard by the sudden surge of violence, scattered in every direction, their chants of no justice, no peace, quickly drowned out by the sounds of chaos and confrontation. David was on his knees, gasping for breath, as he tried to push himself up off the pavement. He had been knocked down in the first wave of officers, their batons striking out indiscriminately as they cleared the street. His ribs ached, his body bruised from the impact, but he forced himself to stand, his mind singularly focused on finding Kendra and getting people out of there before things got worse. Around him, the scene was pure pandemonium. Protesters were running, some in panic, others in defiance, clashing with the police in brief bursts of violence before being pushed back. The air was thick with the acrid sting of tear gas, making it hard to see, hard to breathe. The lights from police vehicles flashed ominously in the background, casting eerie shadows over the chaos. David stumbled forward, his eyes burning from the gas, searching the crowd for Kendra. He spotted her near the barricades, her hands raised in a desperate attempt to hold back the tide of protesters, shouting for people to stay calm, to retreat before the situation escalated even further. Kendra, he shouted, his voice hoarse. But she couldn't hear him over the cacophony of noise. He pushed his way through the crowd, his heart racing as he dodged swinging batons and bodies crashing into one another. When he finally reached her, she was trying to pull a young man back from the front lines, her face twisted with effort. "We have to get out of here," Kendra shouted over the din, her eyes wide with panic. "They're not holding back anymore." David grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the barricade as another wave of police officers surged forward. "We need to move now," he yelled, his voice barely audible over the roar of the crowd. Kendra nodded, her face grim, and together they began pushing people back, urging the protesters to retreat before more people were hurt. But it was like trying to hold back a flood. The crowd was too large, too angry, and the police were relentless in their advance. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the street, followed by a blinding flash of light. David's heart leaped into his throat as he saw a canister of tear gas hit the pavement just a few feet away, spewing thick, choking smoke into the air. "Get down," he shouted, grabbing Kendra and pulling her to the ground just as the cloud of gas enveloped them. The burning in his lungs was immediate and excruciating. His eyes watered uncontrollably, his throat seizing as he struggled to breathe. He could hear Kendra coughing beside him, her body trembling as the gas overwhelmed them both. For a moment, everything was a blur. Sounds, lights, movement, none of it made sense. All he could do was hold on, try to stay conscious, try to stay alive. Inside the hospital, Tamara's grip on the bedrail tightened as the sounds of the protest reached a deafening crescendo. She could hear the unmistakable pop of tear gas canisters, the crack of batons against shields, the panicked shouts of people fleeing. Her mind raced with images of David out there, caught in the middle of the chaos, his body lost in the crush of protesters and police. Her phone buzzed again, jolting her out of her thoughts. She glanced down, her hands shaking as she opened the message. "Kendra, it's getting worse. We're trying to fall back, but the police are pushing hard. David's with me, but we need to get out of here." A sob caught in Tamara's throat, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. She was trapped in this bed, helpless, while the people she loved were out there in the middle of a nightmare. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking as tears streamed down her cheeks. "Please, let them be okay." Her hand drifted to her belly again, her fingers trembling as she whispered to her baby, "We're going to get through this. You're going to be safe. I promise." But even as she said the words, she wasn't sure if they were true. David and Kendra stumbled through the smoke-filled street, their lungs burning, their eyes streaming with tears as they tried to make their way out of the chaos. The tear gas had dispersed the crowd, but the police were still pushing forward, rounding up protesters and forcing them back. "We need to get to the hospital," David shouted, his voice raw from the gas. "We have to make sure Tamara's safe." Kendra nodded, though she was struggling to keep up, her breath coming in ragged gasps as they moved through the chaos. "We'll make it," she said, her voice shaky. "We just have to get through this." But as they rounded the corner toward the hospital, a line of police officers blocked their path, their shields raised, their batons at the ready. David's heart sank. They were trapped. "Stay calm," he whispered, his hand tightening around Kendra's arm as the officers advanced. "We're not looking for trouble." But the officers didn't care. They swung their batons with brutal force, driving the protesters back, and David felt the sharp crack of pain as one of the batons struck him across the chest. He fell to the ground, gasping for air, his vision blurring as the pain radiated through his body. Kendra screamed, her voice barely audible over the din of the crowd. She knelt beside him, trying to pull him to his feet, but the weight of the blow had knocked the wind out of him, leaving him breathless and dazed. "David," Kendra shouted, her voice filled with panic. "Come on, we have to move." But David couldn't. The pain was too much. His chest burned with every breath, his limbs heavy and unresponsive. He could hear the crowd around him, could feel the crush of bodies as people tried to flee, but all he could focus on was the searing pain in his ribs. "This can't be it," he thought desperately, his mind racing as he struggled to stay conscious. "I can't die here. Not like this." But then, through the haze of pain and confusion, he heard something, a voice, faint but clear, cutting through the chaos like a lifeline. "David." He blinked, his vision clearing just enough to see Tamara standing in the doorway of the hospital, her face pale and streaked with tears as she called out to him. "David, please, get up." Her voice was like a shock to his system, jolting him back to reality. With a groan, he forced himself to his feet, his body screaming in protest as he staggered toward her. Kendra was beside him, supporting him as they made their way through the throngs of fleeing protesters. When they finally reached the hospital, Tamara was there, her arms outstretched, her face a mask of relief and fear. "David," she sobbed, wrapping her arms around him as he collapsed into her embrace. "Thank God. I thought I lost you." David held her tightly, his chest still aching, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. But he was alive. He was here, and that was all that mattered. For a long moment, they stood there, clinging to each other as the world around them continued to spiral out of control. The protest raged on, the sounds of chaos and violence echoing through the streets. But in that moment, nothing else mattered. They were together. They were safe. But even as they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, David knew that this was only the beginning. The fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next morning, the city was eerily quiet. The protest had finally been dispersed in the early hours of the morning, leaving behind a city scarred by the night's violence. The streets were littered with debris, the smell of tear gas still hanging in the air, and a hospital was surrounded by news crews, their cameras trained on the scene of the previous night's battle. Inside the hospital, Tamara sat by the window, her hand resting on her swollen belly as she watched the sunrise over the skyline. The world outside was still, but she knew it wouldn't last. The fight for justice, for her baby, for all those who had been wronged, was far from over. David sat beside her, his face bruised, his body aching, but his spirit unbroken. He had been through hell, but he had come out the other side. And now, more than ever, he was determined to keep fighting. "We're not done yet," he said quietly, his voice filled with resolve as he reached for Tamara's hand. "This isn't the end." Tamara nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "No," she agreed, her voice steady. "It's just the beginning." Because they weren't fighting just for themselves anymore. They were fighting for a future, one where their child could grow up free from fear, freed from the violence that had plagued their lives for so long. And they wouldn't stop. Not until justice was served. Not until the world was changed. Not until they won.